My name is Melissa Carpenter. I am 36 years old, and my sister has been signing my mother's name on legal documents for 3 years. Actually, that is not where it starts. Let me go back. It starts with a tape measure, a brass one scarred along one edge with two initials carved into the handle. MC my initials, not my sister's. I need you to hold on to that detail because it matters later more than I understood at the time. I was standing in my parents' driveway in Fairview Heights, a small town outside Cincinnati, on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving last year. I had just parked my car behind a silver Lexus that was not mine and was not my father's. I remember looking at that car for longer than made sense. I remember thinking, whose is that, before I let myself think anything else. That is not the beginning either. I keep doing this. My therapist tells me it is normal to circle a wound before you touch it directly. I am going to try to just tell it the way it happened in order, even when the order does not flatter me. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. This is where we share real-life inspired tales of family conflict, betrayal, and the quiet strength it takes to stand your ground. If these stories speak to you, drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Okay, let me actually start. I am an architect. I work for a mid-sized firm in Columbus called Bell Harrow Associates. I have been there 11 years. I design school renovations mostly, gymnasiums and cafeterias, and the kind of buildings nobody notices unless something is wrong with them. I moved to Columbus for graduate school when I was 23. My sister Denise stayed in Fairview Heights. That is an important fact, but it is not the whole story, and for years I let it be the whole story. I told myself Denise stayed because she liked it there. I told myself I left because I wanted more. Both of those things were true, neither of them explains what happened. Our father, David Carpenter, owns a hardware store on Route 9 called Carpenter's Supply. His father built it in 1961. I worked there every summer from the time I was 9 until I left for college. I swept floors. I stocked nails by size into the bins near the register. My father taught me how to cut glass and how to mix paint and how to talk to a customer who did not know what they needed until you asked the right question. Denise worked there too, less often, and she hated it. She told me once, when we were teenagers, that the smell of the place made her feel like she was going to be stuck there forever. I did not think much of that comment at the time. I think about it now more than I would like. I remember one specific afternoon. I must have been 14 and Denise 12. A customer came in looking for a specific gauge of copper wire, and my father was busy with someone else, and I walked the man back to the electrical aisle and found it for him without having to ask anyone. My father saw the whole thing from the register. He did not say anything to me directly. He said it to Ray, loud enough that I could hear, "That girl's going to run this place someday." Denise was restocking paint cans 4 feet away. She did not look up. She kept stacking cans in a straight line, and I did not think anything of it, not then, not for 20 more years. I want to tell you that memory because I think it is the actual beginning of this story, earlier than the tape measure, earlier than any of it. A sentence said out loud by a tired man who meant it as a compliment and did not know his younger daughter was standing close enough to hear every word. When I was 12, my grandfather gave me his brass tape measure, the one with MC carved into the handle. He told me in front of my father that the store would need someone who actually loved it, and he thought that person was me. I did not understand at 12 years old what that meant. I understand it now. I kept that tape measure in a drawer in my childhood bedroom for years. I am going to tell you what happened to it, but not yet. I keep wanting to jump ahead, and I have to stop myself. I should tell you more about my grandfather because he matters to this story even though he died before any of what I am telling you actually happened. His name was Walter Carpenter. He built the store in 1961 with money he saved working 2 jobs for 6 years, one at a foundry in Norwood and one driving a delivery route on weekends. He used to tell me, when I was small enough to sit on the counter while he restocked shelves, that a store is not wood and shingles. It is the promise you make to the same people walking through the door year after year. He taught me to read a tape measure before I could read a full sentence, standing beside him at the workbench in the back room, his hand over mine, guiding the brass tab out and back. He was patient in a way my father, busy running the front of the store, rarely had time to be. I think that is part of why the tape measure meant what it meant to me. It was not just an object. It was hours, actual hours, that a tired man had spent teaching a small girl something he cared about. He died when I was 25, 2 years after I moved to Columbus. I flew back for the funeral, and afterward at the house, going through his things with my father and Denise, I found a card he had written years earlier and never sent, tucked into a box of receipts. It was addressed to me, dated the year I left for graduate school. It said simply, "Proud of you, kid, the store will still be here." I kept that card. I still have it in the same drawer where the tape measure used to sit, back in Columbus now, both of them together again. After graduate school, I got the job in Columbus. It is 94 miles from Fairview Heights, about an hour and 40 minutes depending on traffic on 71. I came home for holidays. I called my mother, Carol, every Sunday night. For the first several years, this felt normal. Denise lived 20 minutes from our parents. She had married a man named Kyle Hoyt and had 2 kids, and she was around more, and I told myself that was simply geography. Someone has to be the one who lives close. Here is where I have to admit something I am not proud of. Around 4 years ago, my calls with my mother started getting shorter. She would say Denise already told her about this or that. She would say Denise had already handled the thing I was calling to ask about. I noticed it. I did not push on it. I had a project at work that was consuming me, a middle school renovation in Dublin, Ohio, and I let the noticing slide. I want to tell you the turn happens here at some dinner where everything cracks open. It does not. That comes much later, and I am getting ahead of myself again. Let me pull back. 3 years ago, my father had a small stroke. Not severe, the doctors said, but enough that he needed to slow down at the store. Denise offered to take over the books. I remember being relieved when my mother told me this on the phone. I remember saying, "That's good, she's closer, that makes sense." I said that. I want you to know I said that because it means what happened next is partly on me for not asking more questions. I visited 6 weeks after the stroke. My father was recovering well, he was walking without the cane by. Then joking the way he always joked, standing behind the counter like nothing had changed. But something had changed, and it took me a full day of being in that house to understand what it was. My bedroom, the one I grew up in, had been converted into a home office. Denise's home office for the bookkeeping she was now doing for the store. My bed was gone. My dresser was gone. The corkboard where I used to pin my drafting sketches as a teenager was gone. I stood in that doorway and felt something behind my ribs pull tight, the way a seatbelt locks when you brake too fast. I did not say anything to my mother that night. I told myself it was practical, someone needed an office, I was the one who moved away. That is the guess I made. I want to be honest that it was a guess, and for a long time I believed it completely. I thought my family had simply reorganized around proximity the way families do. The daughter who stayed got the space. The daughter who left got visits twice a year. I told myself that was fair, even when it did not feel fair, because feeling something and being right about something are not the same thing, and I did not trust my own feelings enough back then. I need to tell you about the tape measure now because I skipped past it and it is going to matter. When my bedroom was cleared out, the drawer where I kept the brass tape measure was cleared out too. I asked my mother where my old things had gone. She said Denise had put some boxes in the garage. I looked in the garage. I did not find the tape measure. I told myself it was in a box I had not opened yet. I let it go. I want you to remember that I let it go, because I am going to come back to this moment 3 separate times before this story is finished, and each time I come back to it, I am going to know a little more than I knew before. 2 years ago, my mother started forgetting things in a way that felt different from ordinary forgetting, small things at first. She would ask me the same question twice in one phone call, a week apart. She called me by my aunt's name once, just once, and then corrected herself so quickly I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. I remember a Sunday call in particular. She asked me how the Dublin school project was going, and I told her, and 20 minutes later, near the end of the same call, she asked me again, word for word, how the Dublin school project was going. I sat very still on my end of the line, my phone pressed hard against my ear, and I answered again as if it were the first time, because something in me did not know what else to do with the moment. I brought this up with Denise on the phone that same week. She was quiet for a second, and I heard in the background the sound of a cabinet closing, sharp and deliberate. She said Mom was just tired, that she had been dealing with Dad's recovery and it was wearing her down. That explanation made sense to me at the time. I accepted it the way you accept an explanation you want to be true. I asked Denise if she thought we should mention it to Mom's doctor. There was a pause before she answered, longer than the question required. She said, "Let's not make a big thing out of it yet. I'll keep an eye on it when I take her to her appointments." I said, "Okay." I want you to know I said okay easily, without any resistance, because trusting my sister to keep an eye on our mother felt, at the time, like the most natural thing in the world. I am telling this story out of order because that is how I lived through it, in pieces, with long gaps where I convinced myself nothing was wrong. I am going to try to slow down now and tell you about last Thanksgiving directly, because that is where the guessing stopped and the finding started. I arrived Wednesday afternoon, the day before Thanksgiving, the way I always did. That is when I saw the silver Lexus in the driveway. I did not know yet that it belonged to Denise. My parents had always driven practical cars, a Honda and an older Ford truck. A Lexus did not fit. I walked into the kitchen and my mother was at the stove, and Denise was sitting at the table going through a stack of papers, and my father was in the den watching television with the volume too high, the way he does when he does not want to be part of a conversation. My mother hugged me. She smelled like rosemary and dish soap, the same as always, and for 1 second everything felt normal. Then I noticed the seat Denise was sitting in. It was my chair, not a similar chair. My actual chair, the one at the end of the table nearest the window, the one I had sat in every Thanksgiving of my life because I was the older sister and that had simply always been where I sat. There were papers spread out in front of her, organized into 3 piles, and a laptop open beside them. I stood there for a second longer than I should have. My mother said, "Oh, just sit anywhere else tonight. Denise is working on some paperwork for the store." I said that was fine. I did not think it was fine. Something behind my sternum went tight and did not loosen for the rest of the evening. I want to tell you what the papers were. I did not know yet. I am not going to pretend I knew because that would not be honest, and this whole story only means something if I tell it honestly, including the parts where I was slow to understand. That night at dinner, my father asked me about work, and I told him about the Dublin renovation, and he nodded along the way he always does, proud in a way he has never been good at saying out loud. Denise did not ask me anything. She checked her phone twice during dinner. Once, when my mother mentioned that I had been promoted to senior associate that spring, Denise said, "Oh, I think you told me that already," in a tone that made it sound like old news, even though I had not told her at all. I had told our mother. That detail sat with me longer than it should have. After dinner, my mother went to bed early. She has been going to bed earlier for the past year, something I had noticed and filed away without examining. My father fell asleep in his recliner in front of the television, the way he does most nights now. Denise stayed at the table with her papers. I sat down across from her, not in my old chair in the one beside it. I asked her what she was working on. She said it was just routine stuff for the store, insurance, renewal paperwork, nothing interesting. I believed her. I want you to know I believed her completely in that moment because she said it the way you say something true, flat, and a little bored, and I had no reason yet to hear it any other way. I went up to the guest room, which used to be my room before it became an office, and then apparently a guest room again, and I lay there in the dark for a long time. I kept thinking about the chair, not the papers, the chair. It seems like such a small thing to fixate on, and I knew that even as I lay there doing it, but the chair felt like a stand-in for something larger that I could not yet name. The next morning, Thanksgiving morning, I woke up early, the way I always do in that house, and went downstairs to help my mother in the kitchen before anyone else was up. This was our tradition. Just the two of us, peeling potatoes, her telling me stories about my grandmother that I had heard 100 times and never tired of. That morning, she told me one I had not heard before. She said, "Your grandfather always said the store needed to go to the one who loved it the most, not the one who was around the most." She said this while pressing dough into a pie tin, not looking at me. I asked her what she meant. She said, "Oh, nothing, just something I remembered." I did not push her on it. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count since then. I did not push her on it because some part of me was afraid of what she might say next, and some part of me, the part I am least proud of, did not want to ruin the morning. I am going to tell you something now and then take it back because that is genuinely how it happened in my head. For 1 second, standing in that kitchen, I thought, she is trying to warn me about something. And then I told myself I was being dramatic, that my mother was simply an old woman remembering an old man, and I put the thought away. I want to tell you about my cousin Ellen too, because she saw something that day that she did not mention to me until much later. Ellen is my mother's sister's daughter, a few years younger than me, and she had come with her own family for the afternoon. Late in the day, while the kids were watching a movie in the den, Ellen walked past the kitchen office, what used to be my room, and saw Denise through the half-open door, on the phone, speaking quietly to someone she called Mr. Halloran, saying something about needing my father's signature by the following week regardless of what anyone else thought about the timeline. Ellen told me months later that she had stood in the hallway for a second longer than she should have, and had thought, "That sounds like something I probably shouldn't be hearing," and had kept walking. She said she almost mentioned it to me that same day in the kitchen while we were both filling water glasses, and then her son had started crying about a toy in the other room, and the moment passed, and she never quite found her way back to it until I called her in January asking if she remembered anything unusual from that Thanksgiving. I do not blame Ellen either. I have come to understand that almost everyone on the edges of this story saw a piece of it and let the piece go, because a piece alone rarely looks like proof of anything. It only looks like proof once you can lay all the pieces down next to each other. I put a lot of thoughts away that year. I am not proud of that. But I think it is important to tell you honestly, because the version of this story where I was clear-eyed and suspicious the whole time would not be true, and I promised myself I would tell you the true version. Let me pull back further because I keep sliding toward Thanksgiving dinner and the reveal, and I am not ready to tell you that part yet. There is a piece from about a year before that I need to lay down first, because without it, nothing that happens at dinner will make sense. About 14 months before that Thanksgiving, I called my father's store directly on a Tuesday afternoon because I wanted to ask him something about a leaking pipe in my condo in Columbus. A man named Ray Alvarez answered. Ray had worked the counter at Carpenter's Supply since before I was born. He knew me since I was in diapers, he liked to say. Ray told me my father was in the back, and while I waited, he made small talk, the kind you make with someone you have known your whole life. He said, "It's good your sister's handling things now, your dad needed the help." Then he paused, and something in that pause caught my attention even over the phone. He said, "You should come by sometime and look at the new account setup just so you know how it works." I did not think much of it then. I said, "Sure, I'll stop by next time I'm in town." I did not stop by. I want to be honest about that too. Ray Alvarez tried to tell me something in that pause, and I did not hear it because I was standing in my kitchen in Columbus with a leaking pipe and a work call in 20 minutes, and I did not have room in my head for a warning I did not know I was being given. I think about Ray a lot now. He saw something. He never said it directly, not that day, and not for a long time after. He is the kind of man who believes it is not his place to interfere in a family's business, even when the family's business is happening right in front of him at the register every day. I do not blame him. I understand it now in a way I did not understand it then. Okay, Thanksgiving dinner. I am going to tell you what I saw, and then I am going to tell you what I found out afterward, and then I am going to tell you the truth because those three things are not the same, and I did not have all three at once. I got them one at a time over the following 6 weeks, and each one changed what the one before it meant. Here is my guess, the one I walked away from that dinner table believing. Dinner was at 4. My Aunt Pat, my mother's older sister, had come in from Dayton, which she did most years. We sat down, 17 of us, counting my sister's kids and a cousin's family, and my father said grace the way he always does, short and a little awkward, the same words nearly every year. I sat where Denise told me to sit, 2 seats down from my old chair, and Denise sat in my old spot at the head near the window, and nobody but me seemed to notice this had become permanent. Partway through dinner, my father stood up to make a toast, something he does every year, a few sentences about gratitude and family. This year, he added something new. He said, "And I'm grateful the store's in good hands going forward with Denise handling things the way she has been." He raised his glass. Everyone raised theirs. I raised mine too, a half second late. I smiled. I want you to know I smiled because that is what you do at a table full of family on a holiday, even when something behind your ribs has gone cold and still. My guess in that moment was simple. I thought they have decided Denise will run the store because she is here and I am not, and nobody discussed this with me because they assumed I would not want it anyway since I have my career in Columbus. I told myself that guess for the rest of the meal. I told myself it while I helped clear plates. I told myself it in the car on the drive back to my hotel that night because I had started staying at the Hampton Inn off Route 9 those last 2 visits instead of the guest room, something I had not fully examined the reason for. That guess lasted exactly 19 days. I want to tell you about the drive back to Columbus that Thanksgiving night because I think about it often. I left the Hampton Inn around 9, roads mostly empty, the radio off. Somewhere past the exit for Blue Ash, I caught myself gripping the steering wheel harder than the driving required. I loosened my hands on purpose, one finger at a time, and noticed my jaw was doing the same thing, clenched so tight it ached when I finally let it go. I kept replaying the toast. I'm grateful the store is in good hands going forward. I turned that sentence over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's underneath it. Good hands going forward implied something had already been decided, not being discussed, not being considered, decided. I did not know yet how right that instinct was. I only knew that somewhere behind my sternum, something had gone tight and had not loosened by the time I pulled into my own driveway 2 hours later. On the 20th day after Thanksgiving, my Aunt Pat called me. Pat is 71, sharp as anyone I know, a retired bookkeeper herself, and she does not call people just to chat. She asked if I had a few minutes. I said, of course. She asked if I was sitting down. I said yes, even though I was standing in my kitchen because something in her voice told me I should be sitting. She said, Melissa, I need to tell you something, and I've gone back and forth on whether it's my place, but I don't think anyone else is going to tell you. My stomach dropped and stayed there. I did not say anything. I let her keep talking because I could hear that she needed to get it out in one motion or she might not finish it at all. She told me that at Thanksgiving, while I was in the kitchen helping clean up, she had gone looking for a bathroom upstairs since the one downstairs had a line and she had ended up in what used to be my old bedroom, now the office. She said she had not meant to look at anything. She said a folder was open on the desk and her eyes landed on it before she could stop them the way eyes do. She described the desk to me in more detail than I expected, the way people do when they are trying to convince themselves and you that they remember something accurately. She said there was a coffee mug on the corner, half full gone cold, with a faint ring stain on the desk beside it like it had sat there a long time. She said there was a laptop open to an email, though she had not read the email, had only glanced at it long enough to see Denise's name in the sender line and a subject about a closing date. She said the folder itself was thick, the kind that does not close flat. She said the folder had a durable power of attorney form in it, for both my mother and my father, naming Denise as sole agent. She said there was also a real estate listing agreement, drafted but not yet signed, for Carpenter's Supply, listing the property with a commercial broker in Cincinnati. She said the asking price on the listing was $640,000. I asked her if she was certain about the figure. She said, Melissa, I balanced books for 32 years, I do not misread a number like that. I believed her immediately. There was no world in which I did not believe her. I asked her why she had waited 19 days to tell me. She was quiet for a moment. She said, because I kept telling myself it might be nothing, some kind of estate planning thing your parents were doing on their own, and it wasn't my business to go stirring up worry over something I only saw for 10 seconds. She said she had almost talked herself out of calling at all twice, and had finally decided that if she was wrong, I would forgive her for worrying too much, and if she was right, she would never forgive herself for staying quiet. I stood in my kitchen and did not say anything for what felt like a long time. Pat finally said, Melissa, are you there? I said yes. I said it in a voice that did not sound like mine. That was what I found, not yet the truth. What I found was two documents in a folder, seen for a few seconds by a woman who was not supposed to be in that room. It was enough to change my guess completely, but it was not yet enough to understand the whole shape of what had happened. Here is where I sat with something for 3 days before I did anything about it. I want to tell you about those 3 days honestly, because I did not immediately drive to Fairview Heights and confront anyone. I am not built that way, and I do not think confronting anyone that fast would have gotten me anywhere close to the truth. I sat in my apartment on a Saturday morning with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me, and I made myself write down everything I actually knew as opposed to everything I was afraid of. I wrote bedroom cleared out 3 years ago, tape measure missing, mother forgetting things worse lately, Denise handling books since the stroke, Denise sitting in my chair, father's toast about the store being in good hands, power of attorney naming Denise alone, real estate listing for the store unsigned. I looked at that list for a long time. My hands were cold even though the apartment was warm. I thought this could still be innocent. People consolidate financial responsibility when a parent is aging. It happens all the time. A power of attorney is not a crime. A real estate listing that is not signed is not a sale. I want to be honest that I spent real energy trying to talk myself out of what this list was telling me, because the alternative, that my sister had been quietly taking my parents' lives apart for 3 years while I called on Sundays and believed what I was told, was more than I wanted to hold. I spent that whole Saturday circling the same handful of facts, rearranging them, trying to find an order that made them mean something smaller than what they seemed to mean. By evening, I had accomplished nothing except a headache and a second pot of coffee I did not finish. I did not call anyone that day. I sat with it, the way you sit with a bruise before you know yet how deep it goes, pressing on it occasionally just to see how much it still hurts. That Sunday, I called my mother the way I always did. I asked her gently if she remembered signing anything for Denise recently, any paperwork. There was a pause on the line, longer than a normal pause. She said, Oh, I don't really remember, honey. Denise handles all that now. She's so good with it. Something in the way she said it, breezy, a little too quick, made my throat go tight. I did not push further. I told her I loved her and I would see her soon. I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor for a while, my back against the cabinet, not really thinking anything, just sitting there. I want to tell you what I did next, but I keep wanting to skip ahead to the moment everything came out, and I have to stop myself again because there is a step in between that matters more than I understood at the time. I called a lawyer. Her name is Linda Kwan, an elder law attorney in Columbus with an office off High Street. I had found her name years earlier when a coworker recommended her for a completely unrelated matter, and I had kept her card in a drawer without ever expecting to need it. Linda listened to everything I told her without interrupting, which I appreciated more than I expected to. When I finished, she asked a few clarifying questions. Had my mother been formally diagnosed with any cognitive impairment? I said not that I knew of, but that something seemed different. Had my father regained full capacity after his stroke? I said yes, as far as I knew, his mind was sharp, it was his body that had been affected. She asked me to describe, as precisely as I could remember, everything Pat had told me about the folder. I repeated it slowly: the power of attorney, the listing agreement, the $640,000 figure. Linda made a small sound, not quite a sigh, and said, "That's a significant amount of ground to have covered without any of the rest of the family knowing. I want to ask you something, and I want you to think honestly before you answer. Do you believe your sister would tell you the truth if you called her right now and asked her directly?" I sat with that question longer than I expected to need. Finally, I said, "I don't know. A year ago, I would have said yes without thinking about it." Linda said, "That uncertainty is itself useful information, Melissa. It tells you something about where things actually stand between you, whatever the legal facts turn out to be." Linda said something I have not forgotten. She said, "If your father has capacity, then a power of attorney naming only one child, without his full understanding of what he signed, is something we can look into. But we need actual documents, not a second-hand account of a folder someone glimpsed in a hallway." She was right, and I knew she was right, and it frustrated me anyway. I asked her what I should do. She told me gently but clearly that I needed to see the documents myself, ideally with witnesses, and that I should not accuse anyone of anything until I had. She said families come apart faster over accusations than over the underlying facts, and that I should move carefully. I asked her, almost as an afterthought, what happens if I'm wrong about all of this, if it really is as simple as Denise handling paperwork for aging parents. Linda said, "Then you'll have spent some money confirming your family is fine, and you'll know that instead of wondering." I have had clients where that was exactly what happened, and they were relieved to be wrong. I did not feel relieved yet. I felt something colder settling into place, the specific stillness of a person bracing for a piece of news she has not received yet but already half believes. I hired her that day. It cost $3,800 as a retainer, which I paid without hesitating, though I remember staring at the number on the invoice for a long moment before I hit send on the payment. Here is where I need to go back again because I skipped something. I told you Ray Alvarez tried to warn me over the phone 14 months before Thanksgiving, and I did not follow up. After my call with Linda, I finally did. I drove to Fairview Heights on a Tuesday, not a holiday, not a planned visit, just me on a weekday afternoon, and I walked into Carpenter's Supply the way I had 1,000 times as a kid. Ray was behind the counter. He looked up and his face did something complicated when he saw me, something between relief and worry. I asked him if we could talk. He looked toward the back office where I could hear my father's voice on the phone, and he said, "Not here, can you meet me after close?" I met him at a diner on Route 9 called the Wagon Wheel, a place that has not changed its menu or its booths since I was a teenager. Ray sat across from me with his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, turning it slightly on the table, a small motion he did the whole time we talked, like he needed something to do with his hands to get the words out. He told me that about 3 years ago, right after my father's stroke, Denise had come into the store with paperwork from a lawyer in Blue Ash, a man Ray did not recognize, someone none of the family had used before. She had my parents sign several documents at the kitchen table, Ray said, because he had heard about it secondhand from my mother, who had mentioned it to him proudly, saying Denise was taking such good care of everything now. Ray said the store's accounts had been restructured not long after that. He said he used to see the weekly deposit slips, and he had noticed the account numbers changed, and when he asked Denise about it, she told him it was just a new bank for better rates, nothing to worry about. He said the thing that finally made him call me, back on that day I had brushed off, was that he had seen a check written from the store's account to Denise personally for $22,000 memo line reading consulting fee. He said he had never heard of the store paying anyone a consulting fee in 40 years of working there. I asked him when exactly he had seen it. He said the check was dated the previous March, almost 9 months before that Thanksgiving. He said he had noticed it because he was the one who reconciled the register drawer against the bank statement every Friday, a habit my grandfather had started and my father had never changed, and the number had not matched what he expected. He told me he had asked Denise about it directly at the counter on a slow Tuesday. He said she had smiled at him, the same smile she used with difficult customers, and told him it covered mileage and time for driving your parents everywhere these past few years. Ray, somebody's got to get compensated for that. He said he had nodded and let it go because it was not an unreasonable thing to say out loud, even if something about the way she said it had not sat right with him. Ray turned the coffee mug another quarter turn. He said, I've known your family a long time, Melissa. I watched your grandfather build that store into something. I watched your dad keep it going. I did not want to be the man who called his daughter with an accusation I couldn't prove. So I waited and I told myself if it was really something, somebody closer to it would see it too. I asked him if there was anything else he remembered. He was quiet for a moment, turning the mug. He said there had been a woman who came into the store twice that spring, well-dressed, carrying a leather folder who he did not recognize. He said Denise had walked her back to the office both times and closed the door, which was not something that happened at Carpenter's Supply, a store that had never once in his memory had a closed office door during business hours. I sat in that booth and felt my whole chest go hollow, the particular kind of hollow that has weight to it, like something had been scooped out and the space where it used to be was somehow heavier than the thing itself. I asked Ray why he had not told me sooner more directly. He looked down at his coffee mug and turned it another quarter turn. He said, it wasn't my place, Melissa. Your dad's still the owner. I figured if something was really wrong, your mother or your father would say something. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to be the one who broke this family apart over something I might have misread. I understood him. I did not blame him, not really, though there was a small, hard part of me that wished he had said more sooner. He had seen something and said almost nothing for 3 years because it was not his place. I have thought about that phrase a lot since then. It is not his place. It was not Pat's place either until it was. I wonder sometimes how many people in a family's orbit see the shape of something wrong and decide, again and again, that it is not their place, until the thing has gone so far that saying something finally feels necessary rather than intrusive. That was what I found, the second layer, not yet the whole truth but closer, a restructured account, a $22,000 check with a vague memo line, a lawyer none of us had used before, a power of attorney naming only Denise, a real estate listing unsigned for $640,000. I want to ask you something the way I have been thinking about this question myself for a long time now. If you found out someone you trusted had been quietly rewriting the terms of your family for years, while you were hundreds of miles away believing everything was fine, would you confront them immediately or would you wait until you had enough to be certain? I still do not know which answer is right. I chose to wait, and I am not sure that was brave or just afraid. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time because what happens next is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Linda Kwan told me the only clean way to see the actual documents was to request them formally, since Denise, as agent under the power of attorney, technically controlled access to my parents' financial and legal paperwork now. She drafted a letter. It went out on a Thursday in early December, addressed to my father directly, requesting copies of any powers of attorney, financial account changes, and real estate agreements executed in the past 3 years, citing my status as an interested family member and more specifically as a co-heir under my parents' existing estate plan, which I still had a copy of from years earlier. I did not send that letter to be dramatic. I sent it because Linda told me it was the only way to force the documents into the open without accusing anyone directly, and because a formal request on record protects you in ways a phone call does not. My father called me the day it arrived. He sounded confused more than angry. He asked me why I would send something like that, why I would involve a lawyer instead of just asking him directly. I told him I had tried asking. I reminded him gently of the Sunday calls, the vague answers, the folder Pat had seen. I told him I was not trying to attack anyone, I was trying to understand what he and Mom had actually agreed to. There was a long silence on the line. He said, your mother signed some things a while back. Denise said it was just for convenience, so she could help with the bills since I've been slower since the stroke. He said this slowly, like he was hearing it out loud for the first time and noticing something in it he had not noticed before. I asked him if he remembered signing a document that named Denise as the sole agent with no mention of me. He was quiet again. He said, I don't recall it saying that exactly. Denise had the papers already filled out, we just signed where she showed us. I felt that hollow feeling again, spreading. My father, a man who had run a business for 40 years, who read every contract line by line before signing it out of decades of habit, had signed something without reading it because his daughter had put it in front of him and told him it was routine. He asked me to come out that weekend. I said I would. Before I tell you about that weekend, I need to tell you about a phone call I had with Denise 2 days before I drove out, because it changes how you should understand what happened when I got there. Denise called me on a Thursday night. Her voice was different than I had heard it in years, tight, moving fast. She said, "Dad told me about the letter your lawyer sent. What is wrong with you? Why would you do that to this family right before the holidays?" I stayed calm. I want to tell you honestly that staying calm on that call took more out of me than almost anything else in this whole story, because every part of me wanted to raise my voice and did not. I asked her calmly why the power of attorney only named her. She said it was simpler that way, easier for the bank, that lawyers always recommend one agent to avoid conflicts. I could hear something in the background while she talked, water running, then shutting off, then running again, the sound of someone doing dishes with more force than the dishes required. I asked her about the $22,000 check. There was a pause, longer than her other pauses. She said it was reimbursement for gas and time, for all the driving she'd done taking mom and dad to appointments over 3 years, and that I had no idea what it had cost her to be the one who actually showed up. That last part landed somewhere true in me, and I want to be honest about that too. She had shown up. I had not the way she had, week after week, appointment after appointment. I told her I understood that and that I was grateful for it, and that none of it explained a real estate listing for the store that neither of our parents had told me about. She went quiet in a different way this time. The water in the background shut off completely and stayed off. She said, "That's not what it looks like." I said, "Then tell me what it is." There was a long silence, long enough that I checked my phone to make sure the call was still connected. Finally, she said, "I don't have to explain myself to you," and hung up. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time after that call ended. I did not cry, which surprised me. I felt something colder than sadness settle into my chest, the kind of stillness that comes right before you decide something you cannot undecide. I drove to Fairview Heights that Saturday. Linda had advised me to request that we all sit down together, ideally with her present by phone, and that I document everything rather than relying on memory alone. I checked into the Hampton Inn the night before, a Friday, and I did not sleep much. I sat on the edge of the bed around midnight with the folder Linda had prepared, reading through my own notes for the third time, not because I had forgotten anything, but because reading them again felt like the only useful thing I could do with my hands. At some point, I set the folder down and just sat there, staring at the carpet, a beige industrial weave I have never forgotten the pattern of. I thought about calling Denise right then just to hear her voice before the next day made everything formal. I did not call. I thought whatever I say tonight she will use tomorrow. I thought let the table do the talking. I did not sleep well after that. I woke at 5, showered, and drove to my parents' house before anyone else in the family would be awake because I wanted a few minutes alone with my mother in the kitchen the way we used to have on holiday mornings before anything else started. She was already up in her robe, filling the coffee maker. She hugged me longer than usual. She did not ask why I had come so early. I think some part of her already knew this was not an ordinary visit, even if she could not have said what made it different. I asked my mother if we could all talk at the kitchen table, the way we used to when I was a teenager and something needed discussing. She said that sounded fine, in a voice that suggested she did not fully understand why it was necessary. My father sat at the head of the table. My mother sat beside him. I sat across from them. Denise arrived 20 minutes late, and when she walked in and saw me sitting there with a folder of my own papers in front of me, something shifted in her face, quick and then gone. She had brought her 2 kids with her, Sophie and Marcus, who were sent to the den to watch television the moment she walked in. Den my father closed the pocket door too, something I had never once seen him do in that house. I noticed Sophie, who is 9, glance back at the kitchen table before the door slid shut, her face doing something careful and watchful that 9-year-olds should not have to do. I thought about that look for a long time afterward. She sat down in my old chair out of habit, the one near the window. Nobody said anything about it this time. It did not need saying anymore. I had stopped needing that chair to mean what it used to mean. I laid out what I knew plainly, without accusation in my voice, the way Linda had coached me to. I said, 3 years ago after Dad's stroke, you had Mom and Dad sign a power of attorney naming you as sole agent. I said around the same time you restructured the store's accounts. I said there's a $640,000 listing agreement for the store that neither of them remember agreeing to. I said there's a $22,000 check to you from the store's account. While I spoke, Denise picked up a pen from the table and clicked it once, twice, a small mechanical sound that filled the silence between my sentences. My mother's hands were folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale. My father looked between the two of us like a man watching something happen underwater, slow and distorted. Linda was on speakerphone, propped against a napkin holder in the center of the table, mostly silent, listening. At one point, when Denise tried to explain the power of attorney as standard practice, Linda spoke up, calm and precise. She said a power of attorney naming a single agent isn't unusual on its own, that's true. What matters is whether both principals understood and consented to what they signed, and whether the agent's subsequent actions stayed within the scope of that authority. A consulting fee and an unsigned sale of a family business are two different questions, and I'd like to understand both. Denise's face tightened at that. She looked at the phone the way you look at something you cannot argue with because it is not a person you can charm. Denise said everything I did was to protect this family. She said it fast, like she had been holding the sentence ready for weeks. She said you left, you moved to Columbus and you built your career and you called on Sundays and you thought that was enough. I was the one who drove mom to her doctor's appointments. I was the one who noticed she was repeating herself, who noticed dad was getting confused about bills. I was the one here. I let her finish. I did not interrupt, though everything in me wanted to. When she stopped, I asked her one question. I asked, if everything you did was to protect this family, why did none of us know about it until Aunt Pat saw a folder by accident? She did not answer that directly. She said something about not wanting to worry me about handling things so I would not have to. My father spoke up here quietly for the first time in several minutes. He said, Denise, I would have wanted to know. That's not the same as being worried. His voice was not angry. It was closer to hurt, plain and unadorned, and it seemed to land on Denise harder than anything I had said. My mother, who had been quiet this whole time, said something then that none of us expected. She said, Denise, honey, I don't remember signing anything about selling the store. I would remember that. The room went still in a way I do not have good words for. Denise looked at our mother, and for just a second, something crossed her face that looked almost like fear, quickly replaced by something more composed. She said, Mom, we talked about this. It was just in case. We never would have actually sold it without everyone agreeing. My mother looked down at her hands. She said quietly, I don't remember talking about it. I felt something crack open in my chest at that moment, not anger exactly, something closer to grief, watching my mother search her own memory and come up with nothing in front of all of us at her own kitchen table. This is the part where I have to tell you I got something wrong twice, before I understood what had actually happened, and I want to walk you through both wrong versions honestly. My first guess, the one I told you already, was simple. I thought my family had reorganized around proximity and had not thought to include me. That guess died the moment Pat called me about the folder. My second version, after finding out about the power of attorney and the check in the listing, was that Denise had deliberately and coldly planned to take control of the store and cut me out financially, motivated mostly by resentment that had built for years. I believed this version through the drive to Fairview Heights and through most of that conversation at the kitchen table. I believed Denise was, in a simple sense, a villain who had been quietly stealing from our parents. The truth, which came out slowly over the next hour, was more complicated than either version, though it did not make what she had done acceptable. My father finally spoke. He said, Denise, I want you to tell your sister what Dr. Ferris said about your mother in September. Denise's face went pale. My mother looked at my father, confused, and said, What does Dr. Ferris have to do with any of this? My father took my mother's hand gently and said, Carol, we talked about this, remember? The doctor mentioned some memory concerns, and we said we'd follow up after the holidays. I sat there absorbing this. My mother had been evaluated for cognitive decline in September, 2 months before Thanksgiving, and I had not been told. Denise had been told. Denise had apparently decided this was information to manage rather than information to share. I asked Denise directly, Did you know Mom had a memory evaluation in September? She did not answer right away. Finally, she said yes. I asked her why I had not been told. She said, Because I didn't want you to panic and come rushing in and take over everything the way you do with your work projects, treating it like a problem to be managed instead of a family going through something hard. That accusation stung because there was a sliver of truth buried inside it, the way the worst accusations often are. I do treat problems like things to be solved efficiently. I did not know until that moment that this was how my sister had experienced me for years, not as someone who left, but as someone who, when she did show up, showed up like a consultant instead of a daughter. But underneath that sliver of truth was something much harder to excuse. Denise had learned our mother's cognition was declining, and instead of telling the family so we could make decisions together, she had used that window, quietly and specifically, to get both our parents to sign documents that gave her sole control over their affairs and set in motion the sale of a business that had been in our family for 63 years. I asked her the real estate listing was not for $640,000 split evenly. I asked her what the plan had actually been for the proceeds if the store had sold. She did not answer for a long moment. My father answered instead. He said he had asked the same question quietly to the real estate agent's office after finding a business card drawer he was not supposed to find. He said the listing agreement, the actual one drafted by the Blue Ash lawyer, named Denise as sole seller and sole recipient of proceeds, structured through a trust that had been created using the power of attorney, with our parents receiving a fixed monthly payment described as, in his words, reading it slowly off a piece of paper he had brought to the table, a lifetime care allowance of $2,200 per month. He read that phrase twice, lifetime care allowance, like he was testing the words in his own mouth to see if they meant what he thought they meant. My mother reached over and took the paper from him gently and read it herself, moving her finger along the line the way she does when she is concentrating hard on something. The store, if sold at the asking price, would have generated roughly $640,000. My parents would have received $2,200 a month for however long they lived. Denise would have received the rest, structured through the trust, entirely outside of any will, entirely outside of anything I would have had a legal claim to, and entirely without my parents' informed understanding of what they had actually agreed to. I asked Denise directly at the table whether she had understood the structure herself when she signed it, or whether the Blue Ash lawyer had built something more aggressive than she had asked for. It felt important to ask because I did not want to assume the worst version of her without giving her the chance to say otherwise. She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the paper in my mother's hands rather than at any of us. She said I asked him to make sure Mom and Dad were taken care of. I didn't ask him to write me out of the will entirely if that's what that structure means. Her voice cracked slightly on the word entirely. I want to be honest that I do not know even now whether that was true, whether she genuinely had not fully understood what she signed, or whether it was easier in that moment to believe she had not understood it than to sit with what it meant if she had. I want to tell you what that felt like to hear, sitting at that table, but I do not think I can describe it as a feeling. It was more like the floor tilting slightly, everything in the room staying in place while some deeper structure underneath it shifted. Denise was crying by this point quietly, her hand pressed flat against the table. She said she had never meant for it to go that far, that it had started small, just wanting to make sure she was taken care of for everything she had done, and that once the lawyer in Blue Ash had structured it that way, it had felt easier to keep going than to go back and explain it to everyone. I do not think that excuses it. I want to be clear about that even now, even having had months to sit with the whole shape of it. But I also do not think Denise woke up one day and decided to become a villain in a story. I think she started with something real, resentment about being the one who stayed, the one who drove to appointments while I built a career an hour and 40 minutes away. And that resentment got handed a legal tool sharp enough to cut with, and she used it slowly, telling herself each individual step was reasonable. My mother asked to see the folder. Denise, still crying, went upstairs and brought it down. My mother read through the power of attorney with her reading glasses pushed low on her nose, taking a long time on each page, and I watched her read something she had signed and did not remember signing, and something in me went very quiet and very sad in a way that had nothing to do with money. At the bottom of the folder, underneath the legal documents, there was a small manila envelope. My mother pulled it out and her hands moved slower than the rest of her had all evening, careful, almost reverent, the way you handle something you are not sure you are allowed to touch. She opened it and inside was the brass tape measure, my tape measure, the one with MC carved into the handle. I had not asked about it, I had almost forgotten to ask about it in the middle of everything else. My mother held it out to me across the table and I took it, and it was heavier than I remembered, though of course it was the same weight it had always been. What had changed was not the object. It was everything I now understood about why it had been taken out of that drawer in the first place. I ran my thumb over the two carved initials, the metal cool and slightly pitted where the brass had worn thin from my grandfather's own use, decades before it was ever mine. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. My father reached over and touched the edge of the tape measure with one finger, briefly, the way you touch something at a funeral to make sure it is real. I asked Denise why she had kept it. She said quietly, because Grandpa gave it to you in front of everyone, and I always felt like that meant he thought I loved the store less than you did, even though I was the one who actually stayed and worked there every week for years while you were gone. She said she had taken it out of my old room when she converted it to an office, not to hurt me, but because looking at it every day had made her feel erased in her own house. I sat with that for a long moment. I understood, in a way I had not let myself understand before, that my sister and I had been quietly competing over who belonged to this family more, for years, without either of us ever saying so directly, and that the competition had curdled into something much darker once real money and real legal power got involved. That is the truth, the third version, the one I actually believe now. Not that Denise was simply cruel, not that our family had simply drifted apart over distance. The truth is that a real wound about who stayed and who left, about who was seen and who was assumed to be fine because she was capable, got left alone in the dark for years until it grew into something that could genuinely have taken my parents' life savings and their business without their real understanding of what they were signing. I want to tell you what happened after that dinner because I promised you this would be honest, and honest means telling you it did not resolve cleanly. Linda Kwan helped us file to revoke the existing power of attorney and replace it with a new one naming both my father, while he retains capacity, and a neutral professional fiduciary as backup, rather than either of his daughters, a decision my father made himself quietly a few weeks later, saying he did not want either of us carrying that weight or that temptation again. It cost $4,600 in legal fees to unwind the trust structure and the listing agreement, money that came out of the store's accounts, money that used to belong to Denise's plan and now simply belongs to nobody's plan, sitting in an account for our parents' actual future care. My mother was formally diagnosed in January with mild cognitive impairment, not full dementia, something that may or may not progress, something we are watching now with actual appointments that both Denise and I attend together, sitting in the same waiting room, not saying much but sitting there together. The store did not sell. My father still owns it, though he has slowed down further, and Ray Alvarez, of all people, has taken on more of the daily management, paid fairly now, with an actual title and an actual raise that my father insisted on once everything came into the light. I want to tell you about a specific Tuesday in March because I think it says more than any summary could. I drove out to Fairview Heights for one of my mother's follow-up appointments with Dr. Ferris. Denise was already in the waiting room when I got there, sitting with a magazine open on her lap that she was not reading. We sat 2 chairs apart. Neither of us said much beyond hello. When the nurse called my mother's name, both Denise and I stood up at the same time out of habit and then looked at each other, unsure who was supposed to go back. My mother, walking toward the door, turned around and said, "Both of you come on," without waiting for an answer. We followed her back together and sat on either side of her during the appointment, and for 40 minutes we were simply two daughters doing the same small, necessary thing, which is more than I would have believed possible in December. Afterward, in the parking lot, Denise stopped by her car and said, "Thank you for coming today." I said, "Of course." There was a pause, and then she said, "I know sorry isn't enough. I'm not going to pretend it is." I didn't say anything right away. I said, "I know it's not simple for you either." That was all either of us managed. It was not forgiveness. It was not nothing. My father's routine has changed since then, too. He goes into the store 4 mornings a week now instead of 6, and Ray handles Saturdays, which my father says is the first Saturday off he has had since 1994. He told me that on the phone, almost laughing, and then went quiet and said, "Your grandfather would have liked Ray running Saturdays." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just said, "I think you're right." He has started taking my mother on short drives on those Saturday mornings instead, out past the county line and back. No destination, just the two of them and the radio low, something he told me he had not done in years because there was never time before. I visited the store myself in April, the first time in years I had walked in without a specific reason, just to see it. Ray was behind the counter, the same spot he has occupied my whole life. He came around and hugged me, which he had never done before, and said, "I should have called you sooner, back when I first noticed things weren't sitting right." I told him I understood why he hadn't. I meant it. I am not sure I would have acted any differently in his position, watching a family from just outside its edges, unsure whether concern is the same thing as interference. I walked the aisles slowly that afternoon. The electrical section still smells the way it did when I was 14, copper and machine oil and something like dust that has settled the same way for decades. I stood in that aisle longer than I needed to. Near the register, I noticed a small brass plaque I had never seen before, screwed into the counter's edge, engraved with my grandfather's name and the year the store opened. Ray told me he had ordered it himself in February, out of his own pocket, and had not told my father until it arrived. My father, Ray said, had stood at the counter reading it for a long time without saying anything, and then had gone into the back office and closed the door for 20 minutes. Denise and I are not close the way we were as children. I do not know if we ever will be again. We speak carefully, mostly about our parents' care, mostly through short texts. She has not apologized in the full way I think the situation calls for, though she did say once on the phone in February that she was sorry it had gone as far as it did, which is not quite the same thing, and I have had to decide whether that is enough to work with or not. I have not fully decided. Kyle, Denise's husband, called me once in January on his own without telling her. He said he had not known the full extent of it either, that Denise had told him it was standard paperwork, and he had signed off on trusting her judgment the same way I had. He said he was not calling to make excuses for her, only to tell me that their marriage had been strained since everything came out, and that he thought Denise had been carrying something heavier than any of us realized for a long time before it turned into what it turned into. I did not know what to do with that call. I thanked him for it. I have thought about it since more than I expected to. I think about the guess I made at that Thanksgiving table, the first wrong version, the one where I told myself Denise simply lived closer and it made sense for her to take over. I think about how comfortable that guess was, how easy it let me be, and how wrong it turned out to be, not because Denise's proximity did not matter, but because underneath it there was a wound neither of us had ever actually named out loud. I keep the tape measure on my desk now in Columbus next to my drafting lamp, not in a drawer this time. I look at it most days. It is the same object it always was, brass, scarred, two initials carved by a boy who is not my father, given to me by a man who has been dead for 11 years now. But I do not see it the same way anymore. I used to think it meant I was chosen. Now I think it means something quieter and harder to hold, that being trusted with something is not the same as being owed it, and that the people who stayed and worked, unseen in the places you left behind, are owed something too, even when they go about asking for it in the wrong way. I think often about the three versions of this story I told myself in order and what each one cost me to believe. The first version cost me nothing to believe and almost cost my parents everything. I told myself Denise simply lived closer, and it made sense for her to take over, and I let that comfortable guess sit undisturbed for weeks after the evidence had already started arriving, because comfortable guesses are easier to live inside than uncomfortable questions. The second version cost me my sister, at least for a while. I told myself Denise had coldly and deliberately planned to take everything, motivated by nothing but resentment, and I believed that version hard enough that I drove to that kitchen table ready to see a stranger sitting in my sister's chair. That version was not entirely wrong. It also was not the whole truth, and treating it as the whole truth would have meant losing something I am not sure I can afford to lose, even now, even after everything. The third version is the one I live inside now, and it is the hardest one to hold because it does not let anyone off easily, including me. It says my sister did something that genuinely harmed our parents, used a vulnerable window in our mother's health to consolidate control she should never have had alone, and hid it from the rest of us for reasons that were partly selfish and partly, I believe now, genuinely wounded. It says I was absent in ways that mattered more than I wanted to admit, not because I did not love my family, but because I let distance and a demanding career become an easy excuse not to look closely at what was happening 94 miles away. It says my parents, both of them, trusted the wrong daughter with the wrong amount of unquestioned authority, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion and love and the ordinary human instinct to let the child who shows up handle the things that are hard to think about. I do not have a clean ending for you. I wish I did. I wish I could tell you, Denise, and I hugged at that kitchen table and everything dissolved into something simple and warm, the way it might in a story that needed to resolve in under an hour. That is not what happened. What happened is slower and messier, and I think more honest than that would have been. I have learned, slowly and later than I would like, that the version of a story you believe first is very rarely the whole truth, and that the people closest to you can be telling you something true and something false in the very same breath. And your job, the hardest job there is learning to tell the difference before it costs you everything. If you have a sister or a brother or anyone in your life you have quietly stopped asking the hard questions of because the easy version was more comfortable to live inside, I hope you ask anyway. I hope you ask before a lawyer has to be the one who finally makes everyone sit down at the same table. I did not ask soon enough. I am still learning to live with what that cost and with what it did not in the end take from us completely.